This video is brought to you by Link. Is Standard Italian the same as Toscano, specifically the Florentine variety spoken in modern-day Tuscany? Let's find out. Hello number ones and welcome to Metronomes Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages in the most fun and effective way possible. So today's video is inspired by one of you, specifically a comment left in the video Standard Italian versus Regional Dialect. The comment is from Frank Heinke, and it says as follows. Is it true that the Italian spoken in the Toscana is the dialect that is the closest to the Standard Italian because the great poets of the Renaissance came from there? Alright Frank, thank you so much for the great question, but the answer to this question is actually rather nuanced, and in order to be able to answer to you properly, we're going to have to deep dive. This specific topic, what is Standard Italian and how does it connect to Tuscan, was something that fascinated me so much during my formative years at university that I did spend quite a bit of time trying to fully understand it. So make sure to watch until the end, because on this video I will be revealing things that you will have heard for the first time and will blow your mind. The first thing I'd like to say is that Standard Italian is indeed based on the Tuscan language, but it is not the same as the language spoken in Tuscany. In other words, let's say that you were to move to Florence and spend a few years there and you learn to speak with the exact same accent, same word usage, same grammar points. You sound exactly like a native from Florence. Would that make you a speaker of Standard Italian? No. You would have a Florentine accent, some of the words you use would be different from Standard Italian. But how so? Well, let me explain. To make things even more complicated, there is one expression that some people use in Italy that is the following. Il miglior italiano è il toscano in bocca a un romano. So the best Italian is the Tuscan language in the mouth of a Roman. And it's also interesting to note that when you look at voice actors, a lot of professional voice actors in Italy are from Rome. You also have people from Sicily, people native of Naples, people from Milan. If Standard is based on Tuscan and the Florentine variety is the closest to Standard Italian, then why are they not all from Florence? In fact, if anything, they are a minority. I think the best way to make this a little clearer in your mind is to look at it this way. La lingua italiana è figlia del toscano. So Standard Italian is Tuscan's child. They look alike, but they are not the same. But where is Standard Italian used? Well, Standard Italian is the language taught to foreigners, so every classroom, every dictionary, every book that teaches you Italian is teaching you Standard Italian, not Tuscan. Now, Standard Italian is also used by Italians all over the country, and generally speaking between people that communicate who are from different regions. But keep in mind that the majority of people who use Standard Italian in Italy still use it with a thick regional accent, including people from Tuscany. If you want to hear Standard Italian in its purest form, with also Standard Italian pronunciation, which translates to accentless, so no accent, you have to listen to voice actors. In other words, foreign movies that are dubbed, pure Standard Italian. Cartoons, anime, Disney production, all in pure Standard Italian. Often documentaries, whether it be historical, scientific, they also tend to be dubbed in Standard Italian with a pure accentless pronunciation. And to clarify, when I say accentless, I mean that if a native listens to that voice, they won't be able to say, oh, the person speaking is from Rome, is from Florence, is from Sicily, is from Milan. They just sound Italian, full stop. Also, if you ask me, I think Standard Italian with a pure standard accentless pronunciation is the most beautiful sounding form of Italian. But of course there will be people in the comments disagreeing with me, that's just a personal feel. Okay, so now that we know what Standard Italian is, what are these differences, for example, in pronunciation with Florentine Tuscan? The Italian spoken in Tuscany has some defining features when it comes to its pronunciation. One of the most famous ones being the gorgia, which I will address in a minute. But I would like to begin with something called the weakening of the G. As you probably already know, Standard Italian has two different ways to pronounce the letter G, as a soft G and as a hard G. A soft G has a sound J, like in the word giacca, gente. And the hard G, which is pronounced that way when it's followed by an H, has a G sound, gatto or ghetto. Now, if you speak Italian with a Tuscan accent, something happens to the pronunciation of the soft G, specifically called a phonological alteration of the weakening of the intervocalic sound. In English, that means that the J becomes a J. Rather than giving you technical words, I want to give you an example. La gente becomes la gente.
Studiare la psicologia.
Progetto di
Io nella vita gioco a calcio.
So the G has a sweeter sound, a little closer to French. Another similar phenomenon happens to the C in its voiceless post-alveolar affricate form, ch. So in standard Italian, the C can be pronounced ch or k. We're going to focus on the ch version. La cena, certo, certamente. Ch, ch, ch. Now, in the Tuscan variety, when this letter is found in between vowels, what happens is a weakening. So ch slides back to sh. La cena, I 500, rather than I 500.
E mi piace anche molto, piace anche.
I'd like to underline that this specific phenomenon is not exclusive of Tuscan, but it also happens to my own regional language, meaning Sicilian, in the variety I speak. Not all Sicilian varieties do this, but the variety in Palermo does have this. And so I do say 500 rather than 500 when I'm using my own native pronunciation. But now I'd like to mention the kind sponsor, in fact the very first sponsor on this new channel, Link. Link is a language app that lets you learn from the content you love, focusing on input, namely reading and listening in your target language. Worth on note the fact that the app has been recently redesigned. It comes with thousands of hours of content that includes audio and text, and of course you can also look up words and phrases. You can import content from YouTube, Netflix, blogs, news and much more. So you can use Link to build your own library and get fluent using content you love. Which I always advocate on this channel, in fact, I mean it's my intro. Now there is a plethora of languages you can choose from on Link, but personally I've been using it mainly for two languages, my Japanese and my Mandarin. So my focus on the app has been more intense for Mandarin and I have to say, impressive. The app tracks your statistics, it's available on mobile, and it was co-founded by Steve Kaufman, and I'm pretty sure every one of you already know the guy. Much respect. Now, if you want to try out Link, absolutely click the link in the description box and you will get a 35% discount if you decide to upgrade your account using my link. And big thanks to Link for sponsoring this video. Okay, so what is this Tuscan gorgia? Now, between Italians, this is probably one of the most famous characteristics of the Tuscan accent, specifically the Florentine variety. With that being said, I do need to say two things. First, not everyone uses it in Tuscany. Number two, when people who are from other regions of Italy try to put this on to sort of have a little bit of a impression of a Tuscan, then we tend to overuse it. But here is what it is from a technical perspective. The Tuscan gorgia is a linguistic phenomenon that affects the following sounds: k, t, p. In the case of the k sound, which in Italian can be formed by a simple C, like in the word cane, or a ch, like in the word chiesa, people in Tuscany who do use the gorgia will render it as an aspirated H. Note, however, that this only happens in post-vocalic position, so if you have a word on its own, cane, casa, they pronounce it like a k, but if there is a vowel before, it becomes la hasa.
musica, arte, cose umanistiche.
Camminare, mi piace tanto camminare.
Mi piace molto cantare, però preferisco farlo da sola con me stessa. Cantare, principalmente l'arte, la cultura, tutto quello che può arricchire la mia sapienza, diciamo.
Un vocabolario molto interessante.
So keep in mind that the gorgia only manifests itself when it's not followed by a competing phenomenon such as the syntactic gemination. I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video. So what happens with the T? This is gonna blow your mind, but people in Tuscany tend to pronounce the T in some specific positions, I'll tell you more about that, as a TH in English, as a th. And they are the only Italians who have the th sound. No other Italian has that sound natively.
Andare in moto.
Volontariato e
che è nato da un...
In a way kind of similar to how people in Madrid, in Spain, are the kind of only ones in that area who have the th sound, such as in corazón, gracias, whereas a lot of other Spanish speakers will just render it as a s sound, gracias. Also, depending on what city you're from in Tuscany, some people will completely remove the T. Completely. And in a way, this kind of reminds me of what Cockneys do when they say water instead of water. And that is one of the reasons why, in my opinion, London and Florence, linguistically speaking, are very overlappable. But that will require a dedicated video, let's move on. Another thing that sometimes happens, but it's a lot less common, is the affrication of the S, in the sense that in standard Italian you would say il sole, il sole, but some people who speak with a Tuscan accent will cancel out the L and just say il sole. But not many people do that. So we have seen some of the characteristics when it comes to pronunciation, but what about morphology? Another characteristic of Tuscan speakers, which sort of sets them aside when compared to just regular standard Italian, is the heavy usage of the accusative pronoun te instead of tu, which occurs in emphatic clauses. Standard Italian tu lo farai, no? Versus te lo farai, no? The next morphological phenomenon was so typical and so old that it was even mentioned by Alessandro Manzoni himself, the creator of the Promessi Sposi. And it's the doubling of the dative pronoun. Let's have a look at how Standard Italian renders the English sentence I like it. In Italian, I like it is translated as a me piace or mi piace. For those of you who either don't know Italian or are mostly beginners, the verb to like and how we use it can be a little bit of a stumbling block and something a little complicated to get a grasp on for early beginners. That is because in reality, when you look at it literally, we don't say I like it, we say it pleases me. Now when we say the doubling of the dative case is when you say a me mi piace or a me mi garba with the verb garbare, which is intensively used in Tuscany only as an alternative to piacere. Now given they are not the only ones who say a me mi, people do use it in other regions as well, but according to Standard Italian and language purists, it's redundant and you don't need it. A me piace or mi piace. Your vocabulary, however, is another point of difference, and that's how we can connect to the usage of the verb garbare, mi garba. That is only one of the many verbs that people in Tuscany prefer, even though no one else uses them in the rest of Italy, and to be honest, they're not really part of Standard Italian. With that being said, to give you a little bit of an insider perspective as a native, whenever I hear someone with a Tuscan accent using the verb mi garba, it's actually quite endearing to me. Also, if you've ever heard people from Tuscany speak, you'll notice that two of the most used verbs in Italian, fare and andare, tend to have a shortening effect and they are conjugated slightly differently. In Standard Italian you would say faccio, vado, but often speakers who speak a Tuscan variety, they do use these, but they also tend to use fo and vo, respectively. These would not be used in standard. And this idea of making verbs shorter doesn't only happen when they are conjugated, but also in their infinitive form. Andare, andà, perdere, perde, finire, finì. But these tend to be very common also in the Roman and Latium variety all the way down to, gaeta. But probably the biggest difference is lexicon, so what words they use. Standard Italian prefers la vecchietta, but a lot of speakers of Tuscan say la vecchina. Standard Italian prefers spegnere, but people in Tuscany tend to use spengere and even write it. And to give you a little funny story, the first time I actually spent some time in Florence, I noticed that as I was outside this garage or car park, I actually saw it written spengere, and I thought they did a typo, as I had never heard people use it, but apparently people in Tuscany use it a lot. Babbo, for dad, is heavily used in Tuscany, and also in some areas in the north, whereas Standard Italian tends to prefer papà. We have bove over bue, calzoni over pantaloni, camiciola over canottiera, codesto, which sounds medieval and archaic to me rather than questo, and many others. But the last point of difference between the Tuscan language and Italian spoken with a Tuscan accent and Standard Italian is the intonation. Just like any other region, people in every single city in Tuscany have a slightly different intonation, which is actually going to differ significantly from Standard Italian and its accentless intonation. In other words, even if it so happens that the sentences and phrases that a person with a Tuscan accent will use just so happen to not have the pronunciation and lexicon characteristics that we have spoken of, you can still tell where they are from because of the way they intonate. This is probably why you have this expression il toscano in bocca a un romano, in the sense that if you take the Tuscan language as is and you put it in the mouth of a Roman, then All the Roman needs to do is to get rid of a few lexicon differences, and then they can just apply their own vowels, which are very similar to the way Tuscan speakers have their vowels. But since the person in question is from Rome, they won't have these characteristics like the soft G, the gorgia, and all the others. With that being said, I'm not saying that I 100% necessarily agree with the statement, but I understand where it comes from. Everyone in Italy can learn standard accentless pronunciation, but everyone in Italy, no matter where they're from, will have to go under training that we call dizione, diction. But I wouldn't be fair if I didn't say that people who speak with the Tuscan variety do have an advantage, and that is their vowel system. You see, the Tuscan language has a heptavocalic system in the sense that they have 7 vowels, so they don't just have a, e, I, or u, but have 2 varieties of e and 2 varieties of o. And this is also the same in Standard Italian. Even though many regional languages are also heptavocalic, not all of them, some are pentavocalic, only 5 vowels, but there are varieties that, even though they're regional dialects or languages, they still are heptavocalic. They're not heptavocalic in the same way as Tuscan is, or Roman for that matter. Every time a vowel is closed or open is not based on random chance, but it's specifically based and connected to spoken Latin. In other words, there is always a justification as to where you should say o and when you should say o, where you should say e and when you should say e. And a similar distinction happens with the pronunciation of the Z, which in Italian can be pronounced either as a ts, ts, or as a very soft z sound. Native speakers with a Tuscan accent will naturally know when to pronounce it z, when to pronounce it ts. Not because they know the connection to Latin, but just because of the way they are brought up. To give you 2 examples, Lazio, the Z is pronounced as a ts because it comes from Latin T. Pranzo, the Z is pronounced z because it comes from Latin D, prandium. Now, have you ever heard of the raddoppiamento fonosintattico? Phono-syntactic doubling. Italian is a lot deeper than you thought, isn't it? Never mind. Papati poopi, papi poopi. If you have dedicated more than 15 minutes to the study of the Italian language, you will have already noticed that we Italians tend to differentiate in pronunciation single versus double consonants. Whenever you have 2 consonants or a doubling of the same sound, we pronounce it with a stronger or technically longer sound. Now here is the kicker. Advanced learners and native Italian speakers who study diction will also notice that there is another case in which Italian doubles the sound even though it's not written as a double, and that is the situation called raddoppiamento or rafforzamento fonosintattico. For instance, this word. This means at Brindisi, Brindisi being the name of a city. Even though the B is single, in standard Italian this should not be pronounced a Brindisi, but it should be pronounced a Brindisi with a double B. Now I know that people who are watching who speak a northern variety of Italian will complain about that. They will say, no, I say a Brindisi, and that's fine in a northern accent. But if someone from the north wishes to become a voice actor, they'll have to learn about this rule. If they don't want to become a voice actor, then it's absolutely fine. It's not wrong in their own context. Everyone can speak however they want, and not everyone has to get rid of their accents. The same concept also happens when a vowel is accented. So, not è forte, è bello, but è forte, è bello, as if you had 2 consonants. This happens again in connection to Latin. You see, in Latin, this sentence would have been ad brundisium, 2 separate words, ad brundisium. But when in Italian you lose the D and it just becomes a brindisi, if you don't apply the rafforzamento fonosintattico, it makes it sound as if it's only 1 single word. A brindisi. So, to remain consistent with the 2 separate words in Latin, standard Italian applies the doubling of the consonant. A brindisi. È forte. È grande. È bello. Now, standard Italian has every single one of these perfectly justified in connection to Latin. People in the south of Italy, like me, we tend to apply this rule too much, and then we'll say things like la bambina, which is supposed to be la bambina, and we just double everything. People in the north instead, like my dad, tend to not apply this rule at all, and will say è forte, è bello, è grande, and so forth, which could be considered a form of overcorrectionism, in the sense that they basically speak it and pronounce it the way it's written. It's spelled with 1 letter, I pronounce it with 1 letter, but that ignores its connections to Latin. So what about people in Tuscany? where people with a Tuscan accent tend to do the majority of these correctly, but they also add of their own. For instance, some speakers in Tuscany will double after da, which has been completely dropped by Standard Italian. So Standard Italian will say da Michele, da Firenze, but some speakers in Tuscany will say da Michele, da Firenze. Now there is a lot more to say, but I think as an introductory video, this sort of covers and answers your question. So yes, Standard Italian is the child of the Tuscan language, but it's not the same as the Tuscan language, and there are quite a lot of differences that will allow any native speaker or sufficiently trained student to immediately identify, oh, that person, he sounds from Florence. Alright, number ones, well I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have other questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to click the link in the description and take advantage of the amazing offer from Link. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.